Good evening, and thanks for joining us, those of you who are with us live, and thanks for joining us, those of you who will be watching this from the recording. My name's Daniel Horan, and I'm professor of philosophy, religious studies, and theology, and I have the privilege of serving as the director of the Center for the Study of Spirituality at St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event this evening. Before introducing our guest, I want to take a moment to say a word about our center. Founded in 1984, which makes this our 40th anniversary year celebration, by Dr. Keith Egan, with the support of the Sisters of the Holy Cross and St. Mary's College, the Center for the Study of Spirituality offers programs that promote the engagement between faith and reason and the connection between mind, body, and spirit. As an academic center, it is a hub for scholarly and public engagement, which draws on intellectual resources in the Catholic and broader Christian tradition, as well as how individuals practice faith in their daily lives to develop critical conversations around contemporary religious issues, especially as they relate to women's experiences in society, the academy, and the church. The format for our Ex Libris author series program this evening is threefold. First, Reverend Cassidy Hall will offer a brief presentation about her latest book. Next, she and I will engage in a conversation about her work. And then finally, with the time that remains, we're going to open the floor for questions and comments from those of you who are joining us live. The way you can submit your questions and comments is through the Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar screen. This is also a good time to remind those in attendance that academic events and lectures such as this are in fact not debates but educational opportunities at which local and national experts speak on topics related to their expertise and research. As a Catholic university, St. Mary's College is committed to academic freedom, the exploration of a range of scholarly topics, and respectful engagement, especially in ecumenical dialogue in settings such as this. And we're delighted to have Reverend Cassidy Hall of the United Church of Christ with us tonight. So it's my privilege now to introduce our guest today. Reverend Cassidy Hall is an author, award-winning filmmaker, podcaster, ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and leading voice in contemplative spirituality. I should also say that she's a great person who I've had the privilege to know for at least a decade now, I think. She's the co-host of the Encountering Silence podcast and the creator of the Contemplating Now and Queer Contemplation podcasts. Her films include In Pursuit of Silence and Day of a Stranger. And her recent book, about which we'll discuss tonight, is titled Queering Contemplation, Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality. Her MTS thesis is entitled Awakening Mysticism, with the scholarship of 3 African-American women, featuring the work of the Reverend Dr. Barbara A. Holmes, spiritual directors of Color Network founders Therese Taylor Stinson, and Dr. Joy Bostic. During Cassidy's time at seminary, she also served as the secretary of the International Thomas Merton Society and on the board of Infleshed. In 2012, while working as a counselor and reading Thomas Merton's book New Seeds of Contemplation, Cassidy made a pilgrimage to all 17 Trappist, that is, Cistercian monasteries across the United States. While there, she wrote, interviewed monks and nuns, and photographed about her experience within these 17 spaces. Born and raised in Iowa, she currently serves as Director of Communications for the Heartland and IKC conferences in United Church of Christ, overseeing first communication for hundreds of churches in states like Kentucky, Ohio, West Virginia, and our own Hoosier State here, Indiana. Cassidy currently resides in Indianapolis, where she's joining us this evening, where she is studying for her Doctor of Ministry degree at Christian Theological Seminary, and where she is also teaching a course this fall titled Gender, Sexuality, and Theology. So please join me through the internet, as it were, in welcoming Reverend Cassidy Hall. I almost said doctor, soon to be Reverend Doctor when the DMin is complete. But in the meantime, Reverend Cassidy Hall, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks, Dan. It's so great to be with you, and so great to be with you all. And I am really looking forward to our conversation and getting to just chat more about this topic and explore more of this with you all. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. So I want to begin by saying I'm not an expert. I am not a queer theorist. I am not a queer theologian per se. I have my own queer experience and I have my own contemplative experience. So I want to be very clear that I'm speaking from those experiences today. I am a cisgender, queer, white woman who lives in middle America and therefore have, many privileges. And I want to revere the experiences of queer folks who are marginalized, contemplatives who are marginalized, and the many ways that those voices are important. So first, why the word queer? Because this word has caused so much harm for many people. It's caused so much pain for many people and continues to for some people. And many of us have noticed that there's kind of this reclamation of the word queer. And I really like to talk about the roots of the word queer because it comes from 16th century Scots. And this is when the word meant things like odd or strange, oblique. And so it wasn't until the late 19th century in 1894 that the word began to reference sexuality, homosexuality specifically. And the reason this feels so important is because I love looking at the idea that the majority of the life of this word was something we kind of don't associate with it today. So I'm playing with the word in its fullness. I'm talking about the word in its fullness, right? This idea that queerness as weird, odd, strange, oblique, transverse, and the ways that it can show up kind of as a trickster, right? Kind of in the ways queerness can help us to see differently. And so I say those things like odd, strange, weird, oblique, transverse in positive ways. So to dive a little bit deeper into what I mean by queer and queering, I want to share two stories that might not seem to make sense together. And the first story is about this statue. And I lived in the Santa Monica area for about 5 years before I moved to Indiana. And there I was able to pick up my nephew from preschool from time to time. And his name is Elvis. That is true. And I would drive him by the statue after I would pick him up and drive home. And this particular day, I thought, I'm going to drive Elvis by the statue, tell him who the city is named after, and, kind of give him this great history lesson, right? So sure enough, I drive by the statue, I point out the statue to Elvis, and I say, hey, Elvis, see that statue? That's who the city is named after. That's Santa Monica. And he interrupts me and he says, no, Auntie, that's God. God's a girl. Don't you know that? And I loved this moment so much. So about 2 weeks later, I wanted to kind of check in with this little philosopher and see what he was thinking. So I did the same exact thing. Hey, Elvis, see this statue? That's Santa Monica. That's who the city is named after. No, Auntie, that's Buddha. So I'm gonna leave that story there for a second. But I just love the beauty of his imagination in those moments with this statue. In a seemingly unrelated story, during the long hot summer of 1967, when over 150 protests occurred across the United States related to the civil rights movement, Thomas Merton was in his hermitage doing a jazz meditation over the Hoochie Coochie Man by Jimmy Smith. And what I loved about this is that, Thomas Merton is doing this jazz meditation kind of out of nowhere. It's about a 15-minute audio track, and he's kind of reading Bible verses, he's praying, he's doing these kinds of different things over the music. And at the very end, he says, I don't know how successful it is. Perhaps some of it was a little corny. So to me, these are two ways of showing us how to queer something. To me, Thomas Merton was queering a spiritual practice. He was saying, this is a jazz meditation. He was using what he knew of meditation or what he knew of prayer and playing with it and looking at it differently and doing it differently. And my nephew Elvis was queering a physical statue. I like to think that queering is a way to permeate the impermeable, to shift the solidified, and to move the immovable, even in ourselves. And for me, I've experienced that related to not only my queerness, my identity as a queer woman, but also in my contemplative life. And I've experienced contemplative life as innately odd and strange and transverse. And in that way, I love the union and the marriage of those two. So, a little bit more specifically about the word queer. In my book, I write that queer is not only related to my sexuality, but it is also the way I tilt my head to look at the world. So, this idea of queerness as non dualism and non conforming to the status quo. And again, I could put contemplation in place of queer here. I think the contemplative life and being a contemplative is also a particular way I tilt my head to look at the world. Another quote I love to reference is from the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who wrote Our Lives Matter, a Womanist Queer Theology. And she says, to say that I am queer is not only my self-identity, it is also my active engagement against heteronormativity. So this idea of queerness as this disengagement, this disentanglement from the forces of domination, so the forces of heteronormativity, patriarchy, whiteness, all these kinds of forces of domination, queerness is a way to disentangle. And as the great bell hooks says of domination, where there's domination, there cannot be love. And so, queerness as this movement to disengage from domination, I see as very, very much a centerpiece to how I experience and view queerness. Now, my probably all-time favorite quote comes from a poet, because poets really always know how to explain things better than anyone, in my opinion. And the poet Brandon Wint says, not queer like gay, queer like escaping definition, queer like some sort of fluidity and limitlessness at once, queer like a freedom too strange to be conquered, queer like the fearlessness to imagine what love can look like and pursue it. And again, I love this idea as queerness as magic, queerness as the trickster image, queerness as this movement towards betterment. I often like to talk about how in many of these conversations, it can seem like, okay, so, am I saying queerness is everything? No. And I'm also not saying it's nothing. And what I would say is that queerness is everything in the sense that it's everything loving, liberative, justice seeking. It's this pursuit of liberation and love. So similarly, right, we know that contemplation is not designated or confined to institutional sacred spaces. And the Reverend Dr. Barbara Holmes writes about this in her book, Joy Unspeakable. And this is important to me because she talks about the ways that contemplation lives, amid mourning, amid dancing, amid shouting, she even says. And she also talks about the ways contemplative life lives in social justice activism. And so in this way, I also see the ways that contemplative life and queerness kind of really come together. Because a sense of not being confined. Contemplative life lives outside these binaries and boxes and categories. And there's a particular way in which we all live into it. And again, contemplation's wholeness, relies on our inward solitude and reflection, and also this outward response to the situations in which we find ourselves present and awake. And I always reference this as my favorite definition of contemplation. And the reason is because it blurs that line. It takes away that line. It takes away the idea that it is just one thing or the other thing, and says it is both of these things, and it's necessary and belongs in both of these spaces. And to recognize contemplative life as a part of my action in the world was a really crucial way of me finding and pursuing my whole self, my true self. So, just to say a little bit more, so queerness as this resistance against norms, expectations, binaries, boxes, life scripts, and categories. The reason I say life scripts here is because many of us have to queer our life scripts. Many of us are told you're going to get married at 25, you're going to have 4 kids, you're going to be a doctor, or you're going to go to school, or you're going to do this, or you're going to do that. What are the life scripts you were given or I was given that I've had to queer in order for myself to belong, in order for myself to thrive, and in order for myself to be true to who I am? So this idea of queering life scripts is something I think I experience everyone doing in some way in their life. Queerness as loving presence detached from the forces of domination. Again, patriarchy, heteronormativity, ableism, whiteness, capitalism. Queerness as permission to live more expansively and with greater expression into our own infinite becoming, right? Because we're always discovering more of who we are, and then in turn, discovering more of who the divine is, right? This expansive incarnation, this widening incarnation, as Professor Lisa Isherwood says. And then queerness as prophetic, this idea of a way to see beyond what is for what could be, whether that is a statue of Santa Monica becoming Buddha, or whether that is seeing a issue of housing in our communities and saying, this can be better. Let's think about how this can be better. Let's come up with ideas. Let's be the trickster. Let's navigate this in new ways and tilt our heads to look differently, to resolve, to solve, to pursue liberation and love for the most amount of people. So I also like thinking about the ways that contemplative life queers us, because I don't think we just come to it and kind of just see its queerness. I think it actually queers us in the ways we engage in practices that may be new to us. You know, they're strange, they're odd, and accepting the way they change us. I, for instance, just in the last year, started going to a Zen meditation center here in Indianapolis. And it's changed me. It's been very different from, say, like centering prayer, but it's another form of silent meditation, of silent prayer. And I've experienced that in really deep and new ways. You know, that sense of joining that constant river of prayer, no matter what tradition, no matter what um, way of doing it is happening, whether it's silence or words and those kinds of things. And then experiences. I think contemplative life challenges us to move from experience to encounter. And so, what I mean by that is experiences are pretty tangible. Experiences are things we can often put words to, we can name, we can write down and make sense of. Encounters are more ambiguous. They're more like those moments of awe that you can't quite put words to. And that when you do tell someone about it, you're worried they think you're crazy, or you're worried that they think um, that that's just a normal experience. And so I think contemplative life really challenges us to move from experience to encounter. And similarly, moving our concept of knowing into unknowing and holding the holiness of that space, holding the holiness of unknowing. You know, the unknowing is infinite possibility. The unknowing is the silence. As a monk said to me of silence, he said, it is the tomb of Christ. It is the place of infinite possibility, right? This unknowing is Holy Saturday. It is a gift. It is a pregnant gift full of possibility. And in that way, I think it also relieves us of solutions. You know, we can't know. We accept we can't know. We detach ourselves. We open our clenched fists and we let go. I'm going to actually skip that slide. Well, you know what? I'll play it. It's only a minute and a half. So it plays right away. So I'm just going to introduce it quickly. I heard this actually probably when I first met Dan at an International Thomas Merton Society conference. And this is about the inner stance. And Jim Finley talks about the inner stance of the least resistance. And I think this is important because for me, this inner stance is that inner softening and that outer softening that opens us up to possibilities within and outside of ourselves.
These moments of awakening of which I speak, we cannot make them happen. We cannot make them happen. But we can freely choose to assume the inner stance that offers the least resistance to be overtaken by what we cannot make happen. Lovers cannot make their moments of oceanic oneness happen, but together they can assume the stance that offers the least resistance to be overtaken one more time by the gift of oceanic oneness. The poet cannot make the poem happen, but the poet can assume the inner stance that offers the least resistance to be overtaken by the gift of poetry. Those committed to healing cannot make healing happen, but they can assume the inner stance that offers the least resistance to the gift of healing. Thomas Merton once said, those committed to social justice must be very concerned not to overly identify by the consequences of their effort, because by human standards it may go down in flames. But if you give yourself to it with all your heart, something's being manifested in the world that's indestructible, really. And so what we're doing then is to assume an inner stance that offers the least resistance to be overtaken one more time by these moments of awakening that I cannot make happen.
These moments of awakening that I cannot make happen. That is so crucial for me in my spiritual life, because if I don't step into that inner stance, I am not softened, I'm not freed up, I am not porous enough for those moments to reach me. Those moments of awe, wonder, awakening, those moments where I'm drawn closer to myself or closer to the divine in turn, and the ways in which that can allow my life to be more expansive. I want to end my time here by reading a little excerpt from my book. And I'm going to read from the chapter on queering mysticism. In the early winter months of 2021, I knew I needed to reawaken my connectivity to the trees and the mountains. So as soon as I could find some time in my work schedule, I took myself to the nearest mountain range. Saturated in solitude at the edge of the Great Smoky Mountains, I steeped myself in time of rituals, pauses, fires, stream listening, slowness, hiking, and paying close attention to the ways natural beauty softens me. My jaw released, my shoulders softened, my eyes calmed, and the tenderness of my truest self showed up. On my second day in the mountains, I wandered upon an empty trail and made my way up until a tree caught my eye. Like flirty eye contact from across the room, we kept catching each other. Then I finally worked up the courage to go closer. Slowly approaching her in all of her sugar maple beauty, I eventually put my hand on her chest as if to reach for her heartbeat. Then I turned around and put my back up against hers. Sliding down her spine to the ground, I felt her trunk cup my back like a chair she made just for my body. Just for me, I thought. No matter that the ground was wet, I sensed a deep belonging. And elated by the moment with her, I basked in some kind of a romance taking place between us. This tree She spoke to me the words of affirmation I had been reciting to myself in recent days, words I had longed to hear from outside myself. You are okay, she told me. You are good enough. You belong. You are safe. She reminded me. You will get through this. You will be okay. Then I felt her loving arms wrap around my waist as she whispered what I'd been needing to hear most. You are here. You are here. You are here. My face immediately softened even more, in the way it only does when I'm in love, when I feel safe and vulnerable, when I feel at home, when I'm stilled and I remember to be instead of do, when I recall that being is enough. I am enough, and this moment is enough. For some time longer, I sat with her, embraced by her, and in the silence I listened longer. I softened deeper and deeper into her, feeling like I was falling into her roots of wisdom. Immersed in her silent witness of the world, I accepted her love, her boughs covering me like a blanket. I considered the pathways of her roots and branches binding her to other trees, to other life, to humanity, to you, to me, to us. She taught me to breathe deeply again in that moment of romance. She led me into the mystical encounter of love, where borders dissolve and we can sense the truth of our interconnection. Eventually, the trail called me back. I stood up, bowed in gratitude, hugged and kissed her goodbye. I kissed a tree, and I liked it.
Thank you so much, Cassidy, for the introduction to your to the themes of the book and for that sharing of the passage directly. I was really glad that you shared that passage. I remember reading it and thinking two things. One,
Yeah.
I see now why the publisher in your subtitle emphasized roots. I don't know if you've even noticed that. I was thinking about, we think of root, and the root word of root is radix in Latin, which is, the root like radish, that anchors us into a place of security, a place of foundations. The second thing, and this is, obviously my bias toward Franciscan spirituality, is that I think Francis and Clare of Assisi would appreciate the relationship. You recognize the interdependence and connection with the more than human world, including this tree. Francis might call her sister tree, and so
Yeah.
thanks for that sharing. It's, I think, a good way to segue into a conversation. I think one of the first things that comes to mind for me as I was reading your book and then, hearing your reflections this evening was going back to the very opening sharing that you did, which was to define the notion of queer, how it's been used etymologically, how it's been misused and used as a form of abuse to denigrate others, but then how it's been reclaimed by marginalized communities in recent years. And I was thinking about how, you throughout this book talk about the intersection of queerness and queer identity and queer practice and embodiment and contemplation in a Christian valence, right? Predominantly Christian valence, but more inclusive as well. And it's got me thinking about your own identity as somebody who is a queer cis white woman, but who is also a minister in a Christian denomination. And so I guess my question is twofold, it has two directions. One is, how have you found in talking about contemplation and queer identity and queerness more broadly, how have we found the LGBTQ plus community responding to the invitation to contemplative life, to spirituality, to prayer, to perhaps even the Christian tradition? And then the inverse of that, have you found in your ministry, as a minister in the Christian community, like how have Christians responded to this, seeming maybe juxtaposition?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for that. I think first, I think my experience of queer folks who have responded to the book or responded to some of these concepts has been really deep resonance. And I think that in part comes from the ways contemplation has previously been framed by other folks or folks who don't have a queer experience, right? I think that historically, some of the ways contemplation has been presented, it's been limiting. even to the point of, I always like to say, when I first came to contemplative life, I didn't know how to say it, Dan.
Mm.
Contemplative, contemplation, right? Why do you say them differently? All these kinds of things. And so I think there's kind of this sense of hierarchy that does not belong there, right? For those of us who are contemplative, we know there's not a hierarchy there of, goodness, or, knowing how to pray better or anything like that. And then contemplation is for everyone. And so I think some of the conversations in the book opened up more dialogue towards the recognition that contemplation is already happening in so many of our lives, and that it's something that is for all of us, and kind of, is innately maybe already a part of many of our lives. And sometimes I like to encourage folks who, may not know where to begin or may not have a practice. And I always love to say, okay, begin with seeing where you're already doing it. Begin with seeing how you're already doing it. So I like to say, do you ever pause and look at the window outside your tree? Do you ever take a deep sigh? Maybe it's in anger when you're folding your laundry and your children are screaming. Like, can we recognize that connection to the divine in those moments and recognize we're already doing it, and then build on those, right? And so in that way, I just really wanted to make it this more kind of accessible concept. And again, I don't know that I did that, but I think I opened up some conversations to start talking about that maybe more. And that is not to minimize practice, because I think practice is very important and huge and can open us up to depths we couldn't otherwise reach. In terms of the Christian community and, being in the United Church of Christ, it's mostly been a pretty curious, welcome. I think contemplative life exists in all aspects of Christianity. And it's interesting because I think it is maybe more pronounced in some other, right? Like, I think Catholicism has a pretty big pronunciation of contemplation. And so it's not always something that's familiar in other places, right? We have centering prayer in some places, um, and in other times we take moments of silence, or we take the time to focus on an image or focus on something. And I think in that way, I think some of the language has been missing from other denominations, maybe that kind of haven't maybe been as in touch with contemplation as others.
I appreciate that. One thought I had too was, and this is maybe a recommendation for folks who are interested in learning more about your own journey, but more about some of these themes, to check out the book itself. But you share your experience as somebody who is drawn through your own life experience. This experience, I won't, spoiler alert, I won't tell the whole story, but your experience as a psychologist, as a counselor who was working with really in really stressful, difficult, important, and meaningful, but tiring situations, and finding yourself kind of drawn to this Roman Catholic religious tradition of monasticism. And so, on the one hand, I see this as very Mertonian. I can't resist this. So, referring to Thomas Merton, in that Thomas Merton, for those who aren't as familiar with him, in the early 20th century, was really one of the first, certainly within Roman Catholicism in the US and in Europe. But I think among a lot of, for the reasons you just mentioned, Cassidy, a lot of Western Christians had forgotten the practices of meditation and contemplation and personal prayer, right? In the Roman tradition in particular, it was like, pray, pay, and obey. You went to mass on Sunday. You observed, no meat on Fridays. You prayed the rosary maybe as a devotion. But this idea of going deeper, and Merton, even before the Second Vatican Council, sought to kind of invite people into their own personal relationship with the divine, with God, in a way that many people thought was reserved just for these weird monks and nuns who lived out in the outskirts, right? And so here you are, somebody drawn to this tradition as somebody who isn't Catholic. And now I wonder, I see, like, even in our conversation this evening, and the invitation you offer in your book, an invitation for Catholics, you're kind of returning the favor, as it were, which is broadening access and the vision and the horizon of the contemplative life to all those, including those who might be at the margins of sexual or gender identity, right? Who may not feel welcome in traditional Christian contexts and churches, whether that's Catholic or some other denomination. So I really, I don't know if you feel that way, but I have picked up on those resonances both in your own telling of your own story, but also in what I totally agree with what you said, that contemplation is for everybody. And I think, you share in the book your own journey, complicated journey with Thomas Merton. And I think, like all siblings living and deceased, relationships are complicated, but that he was instrumental in your introduction to this, but then kind of taking it a step further, which is what students, disciples of teachers and mentors do. So I mean, I commend you in that. That's more of a comment than it was a question, but maybe you have thoughts about coming to this tradition and then finding yourself, I would say, maybe guided by the Spirit through your own study, through your own practices, through your own conversations and other work, now inviting others. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And to share a little bit more about, the story you mentioned, I was working as a substance abuse counselor in Iowa, and I was at a community agency, and I was overworked and burnout. And it was at that time when I started reading New Seeds of Contemplation. And I was kind of reading Thomas Merton in between clients, and it was the essay Integrity that just struck me. And in that essay, he writes, many poets are not poets for the same reason many religious people are not saints. They never succeed in being themselves.
Mm.
And at this time, I was out in my queerness, but not like aggressively out, not like not out in the way of fully existing as my true self in the world.
Mm.
And so this idea of not succeeding in being themselves really, really struck me. And I thought a lot more about what that meant for me. I dug deeper into Thomas Merton's writings on the true self. And yeah, I mean, ultimately, that Thomas Merton led me, initially on this journey to find more voices, and then in turn look at my own voice and
Mhm.
recognize and accept my own voice. And Merton modeled that in his dialogue with so many people, DT Suzuki, Abraham Heschel, Rachel Carson. um, and his vastness of communication modeled this wanting to listen to everyone, wanting to listen to other people, to other experiences, and to even engage in new ways of looking at the divine and experiencing the divine. Um, and I wrote kind of an essay that a lot of people reference as the breakup with Thomas Merton essay, which ultimately was about, um, people saying, okay, how do we make sure that the young people don't forget about Merton? How do we make sure that he doesn't, die off? His work doesn't die off. And so I was engaged with that question so much that I kind of finally said, okay, what's so wrong with him dying off? There are other voices, there are new voices. And how can we listen to the fullness of humanity and ultimately the fullness of the divine in our midst if we only listen to the Thomas Merton, if we only listen to the Richard Rohr, if we only listen to some of the people we've held up, which happens to often be um, you know, Eurocentric straight white men, presumably, right? Straight and presumably um, celibate also. So I think recognizing, okay, my experience is not there. None of my experiences is in that, other than this deep resonance with contemplation. And
Mhm.
I love this idea that there's like this thread of contemplation that I can still find in all of these works, right? And recognize it. And like contemplation recognizes itself everywhere. And so in that way, I had to do my own work to find my own belonging and my own truth and my own true self. Um, but ultimately that didn't detach me from that string, right? That
Mhm.
that string still is threaded in my life, still is a part of my life. And learning to hold things, that our teachers may have said that are maybe ignorant or downright wrong or awful, learning to, say, okay, that's not okay. That's not acceptable. That's not anything I agree with, without throwing away maybe the wisdom that we've gained from their life or from their teaching.
Mhm.
And there are times when we can't do that. There are times when, things might be so detrimental or so bad that we need to, you know, be done with the person altogether. But for me, with Merton, it was about being able to hold the two parts and say, it's all here. And you know what? I hope in 50 years, people are correcting me.
Mhm.
I mean, I hope we're all evolving and being corrected and doing better.
Yeah. But I think that's where dialogue fits in, right? One thing you talk about, a thread that unites, and one way I think about this in terms of the study of spirituality and contemplation as a practice is attuning oneself by whatever medium, right? So maybe it's centering prayer, as you mentioned, made famous by the Trappist Thomas Keating, or maybe it's Lectio Divina, like the Benedictine sisters and monks have engaged in for millennia now, millennium and a half, basically. Or some other form of Visio Divina, which is popular these days, where we look to the Eastern traditions, praying with icons. However it is that we engage in contemplative practice, the spirituality beneath that is recognizing that singular thread, which is the spirit, which is God, which is the divine, as you call God. And that actually, that's what brings us together. Not that one has to be attached to one religious figure who brings their own wisdom and their own social location for a time, and maybe that can be critically appropriated, like you said. I hope in 50 years or more, your thoughts and invitations can be critically appropriated as well. But I think that's the beauty of the Christian community, that people are brought together. They complement one another in a way that is, I don't have the whole piece of the puzzle or picture, nor do you, but together, we can reflect the body of Christ. We can build the body of Christ. I'm reminded of something too that Merton says as you were talking about your own experience of engaging in contemplation and finding yourself, right? Is that line he has where he says, what it means to be a saint is to be myself. And
Yeah.
that sounds, I talk about this oftentimes, and it seems like a throwaway line, or like, oh, I guess anything goes. And he means the exact opposite, right? Who are, as he calls it, the true self, as you've mentioned many times tonight, who we are before God, that and nothing more, nothing less. And more often than not, we don't actually embrace it, who we are in our completeness, and therefore we're living a kind of something else, whatever it is, but it's not our true self. Maybe this is a good way to go back to something you didn't mention in your presentation, but that I found very interesting from a contemplative practice perspective and from a kind of theological perspective, which is different. It's in your chapter titled Infinite Possibility. And you talk about silence, right? Silence is like a condition of the possibility of contemplative prayer. And you make some distinctions, such as the difference between what you call toxic silence and loving
Mhm.
silence. And you also talk about the fear of silence. And I've been thinking a lot
Mhm.
in my own work over the last couple of years, but especially at this moment in history, we may have people joining us in this audience too who are experiencing fear maybe of what we're talking about, that this isn't how they thought of prayer or spirituality or contemplation, or fear of something that's different. But I also have found, and you talk about this a bit, fear of silence. We are so distracted and we distract ourselves so easily. So could you say a little bit more about what do you mean by toxic silence versus loving silence? And why do you think people are so afraid of silence in general?
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. So in the book, I like to distinguish toxic silence from loving silence, because we've seen silence cause so much harm in our world. I mean, for everything from the ways we or, a loved one has given us the silent treatment, maybe, to the ways that we have, um, silenced um, marginalized voices, to the ways that, you know, colonization has silenced people groups, through genocide, through all kind. There's a toxic silence that causes harm and that is violence. And I really like distinguishing those, because I think silence needs to be, um, when we honor silence, it needs to be recognized as this loving silence, as this silence that is life-giving and beautiful and centering, but that doesn't mean it's not hard.
Mm.
Because I know for myself, I mean, no matter how much I do a silent sit, I still go through the to-do list, go through the conversations of the day, go through everything until I get to that loving silence, until I finally get to that place of kind of this awe and this openness and this space of wonder.
Mm.
And so I think if we don't distinguish those, um, we can do harm to both, the beauty of silence, but I think we can also do harm to the divine and the ways the divine shows up, because I think we often see God as silent, um, and I don't think that's necessarily wrong nor right, but I think we have to honor the ambiguity of things related to that. And so I remember uh, one of my Episcopal priests back in Santa Monica um, talked about Jesus on the cross and said, by the phrase, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Um, with alongside the concept of the Trinity, this priest said, God is absent in God's presence, and God is presence in God's absence.
Mm.
And so when I go into the loving silence, I kind of meet that ambiguity of God. I kind of meet that spaciousness where everything's there and nothing's there, nothing's there and everything's there. Um, and so I think it's really important to distinguish. And again, that doesn't mean it's not hard. And I think I've had a lot of experiences because I deal with anxiety where silence has caused anxiety, and I've had to learn how to be in it in a safe way and in a loving way for myself. Can you remind me the second part of that? I feel like,
Oh, just about the fear of silence, but I think you're touching on that right there,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, and in the book I talk a lot about how the fear of silence, at least for me, has kind of reminded me of death.
Mm.
Reminded me, and then in turn, right, my fear of death, because silence, it can feel empty, it can feel like nothing. But at the same time, oftentimes when we go into it, we're regenerated, or we are, there's a creativity stirred within us, or we are um, just more settled or more in touch with the divine in our presence. And so I think the fear is just more and more real as we carry around these tiny pocket computers and can go shopping at any time, can text at any time. And so learning to navigate the different silences of life, whether that's, taking a break from the phone can be a form of silence, right? You might still be doing things and talking. And then there's also the intentional silence of kind of maybe a meditation practice. But I think there's different ways that we can practice, especially in our modern day world. Maybe it's, deciding to not watch TV at night for the next month. There's different ways we can start practicing that deeper connectivity to ourselves and the divine.
Thank you so much for that. We've got a number of questions coming in from our audience, so I encourage folks to, we don't have that much time left, but if you have a question or comment, please submit that. One, you were talking about Jesus on the cross a moment ago, and I think this is a good segue to a great question that came in that asks, or that says, quote, I love this idea of queerness and contemplation as, quote, disengagement from domination. Your words there, Cassidy. Can we see Jesus, the questioner asks, as a model of this disengagement from domination? And how do you see disengagement from domination playing out in Jesus's life?
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. We can see Jesus's disengagement from domination in the ways that he interacted with everyone. I mean, the ways he interacted with children, the ways he, pursued the people on the margins, and he disengaged from domination by disengaging from hierarchy, and he disengaged from domination by disengaging with some of the norms and expectations of the day, right? I see him turning over tables as a form of disengaging with domination. And I think that that's, a really crucial way to look at Jesus, because again, where there's domination, there can't be love. And so I think that some of these subversions, also point to the ways of Christ's fullness of love.
Yeah. I think that's a really powerful example, and I know that there are some queer theologians who talk about Christophobia, this because of the way they've been raised in certain Christian traditions or certain practices and views that members of the LGBTQ plus community sometimes feel like they're not lovable or loved by God, or can find Christ as a model, Jesus of Nazareth as an example, and yet the Gospels remind us, as you say, that Jesus's whole practice was one of going to the margins and really flipping the whole. For people who forget, the term parable, the way Jesus taught, was about flipping things upside down. And
Yeah.
I would venture to guess, based on the way you define queerness, that is Jesus kind of queering the expectations, right,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
his hearers. So, speaking of queerness, another question here comes from the tri-campus community here in South Bend. And this is, they say there are a lot of LGBTQ plus students at St. Mary's, Notre Dame, and Holy Cross College, just as there are everywhere. I wonder what advice you might offer these younger siblings on their own spiritual journeys. What would present day Cassidy wish she could tell college age Cassidy? I love that.
Yeah. Oh God, that's great. It's funny because there was a couple stories that didn't make it in the book, and that made me immediately think of one, and that's a story about me going to a LGBTQ event during my undergrad at Iowa State University and turning around at the door. I didn't go in.
Mm,
Um, and I regret that in the sense of, I wish I would have gone in, and I wish I would have come closer to my true self more quickly. Um, However, that didn't happen. So the reason I say that is because I think it is crucial for people to find pockets of belonging, because some people aren't out in every aspect of their life. And if they are, that might be a different experience, but they still need to find their pockets of safety. And so this idea of finding pockets of belonging, I think, is so crucial for young people to really both explore who they fully are. I think one thing I've loved about, hearing about friends' kids or young people is the ways, people are navigating their sexuality in different ways, in the ways that people are more um, quick to think about it. I remember as a kid that what just wasn't something, right? The life script given to me was I was, going to marry a man and probably have kids and, go to school. And so I think, being able to see the ways these kids are already kind of queering these life scripts, but also the necessity they still need belonging and safety. And that being said, I also want to say that I think we really need to pay attention to our rhetoric around sexuality and gender, because it's caused a lot of harm. I worked as a chaplain just, you know, a couple years ago at a Catholic hospital. And that was not a fun experience for me, because as a queer person, I felt minimized, I felt undermined by the nature of this Catholicism, this Catholic hierarchy in this location. And I found that I was doing chaplaincy a lot differently than other people. Um, but just the notion that, like, I, quote unquote, couldn't perform some of the things that we were asked to do. It's not to say I didn't, but you know, um, that being said, I just think it's really important to pay attention to our rhetoric, pay attention to other people's rhetoric, and recognize that those words can cause harm, whether we mean them to or not, and just be open and be open to feedback and be open to changing that so that people do feel belonging, so that they do feel safe.
We've got a lot of great questions and comments coming in here, so we're not going to have time to get to them all. I just want to lift up one comment as I move to another question, which is somebody who's affirming a lot of what they've heard and recognizes, our need to listen to God's voice and call, with reference to the passage in the Old Testament that God is in the whisper and that therefore silence is okay. And so I thought that that was really a great reference back to the Old Testament wisdom. Um, Somebody asks, and this is, I love this question, especially the second part. The first part is posed: is Christian mysticism a commonality in stories of liberation through spirituality? I think I know the answer, given a lot of the particularly people of color you interview and quote in your book. But then the second part of the question is also interesting. Are there any LGBTQ plus mystics that would be worth looking into as exemplary of liberation through a direct encounter with God?
Yeah, absolutely. And I speak to a few of those in the book, and all those LGBTQ Christian mystics, a lot. I've done some research on my own, and the first resource I came across, which I still highly recommend as a starting place, is qspirit.net.
Mhm.
And that just has, it's by Reverend Kittredge Cherry, and she has this incredible resource of varying experiences of LGBTQ saints, and really honors their life, their work, and their relationships for many of them. And yeah, Christian mysticism is a commonality in stories of liberation. I love that. And yes, I mean, I think mysticism is kind of that, you know, that point that invites us into kind of this more submersion or absorption in the divine. And how could we not be moving towards liberation? How could we not be moving towards, love, if that's happening? And so I think that's a great way to put it. The recognition of mysticism's connection to liberation.
That's great. Cassidy, it has been a delight to chat with you this evening. I know those who have joined us live have appreciated it, and those who will be watching in the future will appreciate it as well. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your insights about contemplative life and prayer and the intersection, really, of Christian identity with LGBTQ plus identities. I think this will be a resource for so many people, whether Christians trying to understand the intersection of their faith with the queer community and with those in the LGBTQ plus community trying to bridge themselves, return perhaps back to an experience of faith that maybe has been alienating for all the reasons you've shared as well. So it's been a real gift. Thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Yeah, great to be with you. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you. Before we go, just an announcement to let folks know that the next event we have at the Center for the Study of Spirituality will take place Tuesday, November 12th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And that is our annual Thomas Merton Lecture in Spirituality. Our lecturer this year is Father Brian Massengale from Fordham University, and he'll be speaking on the topic Courageous Hope in Precarious Times. The link in the chat there will allow you to get more information and to register for the webinar if you're not able to join us in person. Thank you again, and everybody have a wonderful night.